A horrific case of alleged abuse that law enforcement now calls a murder. A young boy allegedly losing his life at the hands of his own parents, and his dad was a highway patrol state trooper. This is a story that breaks your heart and makes you wonder just how something like this could happen. The shocking details in court documents that show us the evidence that has led authorities to say this is a homicide. We're on the case presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Child abuse cases will never make sense, even though we see so many of them. And each one, no matter the circumstances, they're not only sad, they're incredibly shocking. But this one has a different dynamic to it because the dad in this case, now accused in the murder of his son, was a member of law enforcement. These are the mugshots for 30-year-old Joshua Latimer and Destiny Dionne. The two of them live in Oconee County, South Carolina. It's a rural part of that state near the Georgia line. Latimer and Dionne were married in 2024, and we found their wedding website. It's still public, that has pictures of this couple getting ready for their big day. We also see pictures of Latimer with this little boy. His name is Isiah. He was just 4 years old. Latimer is believed to have been his stepdad. I'll sadly talk a little bit more about Isiah in just a moment. But let's talk about Latimer. His stepdad, he was a member of law enforcement, a member of the South Carolina Highway Patrol. And like so many of these cases, on the surface, it appears that the suspects are good people. Let's talk about what's alleged against them. According to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, also known as SLED, on Friday, September 19th, it was around 6:20 in the morning, EMTs responded to the home of Latimer and Dionne. According to Fox Carolina Television, the call was for a patient with cardiac arrest. That patient, 4-year-old Isiah. It was not long after EMTs arrived that the coroner was called, and this became a criminal investigation. Now, Isiah's parents claim they found him unresponsive, but they allegedly had a very good idea of what was wrong with their son who had died. We have the arrest warrants for Latimer and Dionne in this case, and I will warn you, the details are just so difficult to hear. They are so difficult to stomach because they say at time of death, Isiah was underweight and malnourished. Law enforcement says that his ribs and other bony prominences were visible. His eyes were sunken into his head. According to police, Isiah weighed just about 21 pounds. For reference, kids his age should be between 30 or 40 pounds at 4 years old. The warrant goes on to say that Latimer and Dionne showed, quote, an extreme indifference to life. The two allegedly did not seek medical care for young Isiah. Latimer and Dionne were arrested, and they're now facing charges of homicide by child abuse for the death of their son. And they're also facing 2 counts of unlawful conduct toward a child. There was also a 2-year-old boy living in that home, and law enforcement says this couple is accused of putting him in unreasonable risk of harm. Latimer had been a trooper with the South Carolina Highway Patrol since 2017, so he had served for a solid amount of time. He had the rank of Lance Corporal, but in the wake of his arrest, he was terminated from his position. Now, originally, the couple only faced unlawfully placing the child at risk or cause of harm charges, but 2 days after those charges were brought against them on September 25th, they were charged with murdering Isiah. A conviction on that charge alone could put them in prison for 20 years to life. Now, as for Isiah, the obviously most important person in this story, it's important to remember who he was and the joy he brought people during the short life that he had. His obituary says that he was the most beautiful baby boy and had a smile that would light up a room and a laugh that would warm your heart. Join us now from South Carolina to talk about this is Dr. Nada Rutherford, the coroner for Richland County, which is a different county than where this case is playing out. And it's never easy to talk about these cases involving children, doctor, but going through the arrest warrant, and I just think of the state that this young boy was in apparently when he was found by the coroner there. Just what stands out to you about his condition when he died?
So the fact that he was described as a kid who was severely malnourished, in order for you to be able to look at a child and those are the words that come out of your mouth. This kid had to be extremely what we would call cachectic, sunken in eyes, just not looking like a very healthy, well nourished child. That's one of the things that you look at post mortem when you do an assessment of a body. You say, does this person seem, does their general appearance seem to be healthy, well nourished? That's one of the first things you write in the autopsy report. And so to know that just even with the charges that were filed, that this was the first thing that stood out is very shocking to me. But there's some things that they can do post mortem to back up what that general appearance looked like of that young child.
Because clearly, I mean, from the outside, I mean, the sunken eyes part, when you hear that, I think of, I mean, frankly, areas of the world where there's famine, and
Right.
that's often what you see. And then we're talking about a case here in the United States and inside the home where someone was a member of law enforcement just makes it really difficult to stomach. How do you go about finding, because clearly, I mean, malnourishment from what you can see on the outside, but what do you look for on the inside to try and figure out the story?
Well, this becomes very detail oriented in terms of the science. So the coroner there, the medical examiner, the forensic pathologist, all of the people who are involved, they are going to take the information that's taken at autopsy, those samples, and they're going to send them off for certain types of testing. And I don't want to get too scientific here. I want our listeners to understand what I'm saying. And so you can have different types of dehydration. You can have what's called hypernatremic dehydration, where the sodium levels in the sample, like in the vitreous or even in the blood, are seen as being really, really high. And we know that in order to have a like a hydrated state in the body, that you don't want super high levels of sodium. So if someone is dehydrated and they have high levels of sodium, you start to see swelling in the brain. You start to see their level of consciousness change. They have altered mental status. And so there were signs of dehydration with this child prior to him dying, that they could have sought care for him. Okay. So, what the coroner is going to have to do, along with law enforcement and all of those samples that they take, they're going to have to show, was this hypernatremic dehydration or was this hyponatremic? We are pretty much guaranteed that this won't be hyponatremic, because that's where you have too much volume in the blood and it's watering everything down. You see that when you have like frat boys who do like a water drinking, chugging kind of contest, and you can actually die from water intoxication. So for hypernatremic, we're going to see high levels of sodium, but we're also going to see elevated levels of the chloride level. And we're also going to be looking at what we call the urea level. So you look at something called BUN, again, not trying to be too scientific here, but that urea level being elevated in the presence of elevated chloride and elevated sodium, those are going to be things that give us that dehydration pattern. And that's one test that, while it may not be extremely diagnostic, when you are looking at this body and you take all of the circumstantial things that go with finding the body in that state, those are going to be things that support a cause of death of dehydration or neglect or whatever it is. It may not be the final thing that killed that child, but in autopsy, they're going to look into the skull. They're going to remove the brain. They're going to weigh it. They are going to look to see if there is cerebral edema or swelling in the brain. And they're going to look at those other samples to see if it complements what they think happened to the child.
And there are pictures of him, the boy, Isiah, within the last, say, year or so, it seems, because his parents, there was a wedding website, they got married in 2024, and then there are pictures from around, it seems, that time. And he seems, at least on the outside, in better health, we'll say,
Yes.
than what's being described in the arrest warrant. I mean, how long would someone have to be going through kind of the phase of malnourishment to get to the point where you have the sunken eyes and all the different details that we read in that arrest warrant?
So most of us have learned that, 3 days without food and water, you're starting to get to that point where you may have hallucinations, your altered mental status, you're not doing okay. But take food out of it. and just do a no water, no hydration kind of thing to a kid. Between 3 and 7 days, you could die from that because again, your body needs that balance of sodium, chloride, urea, all those things that help your kidneys function properly, your liver to function properly, but also that sodium level really helps your brain to function properly. And so when you start dehydrating someone, this is why they tell you if you're out in the sun, drink water, drink electrolytes so that you can keep those things in balance. So within 3 to 7 days, this child could have died. So it didn't have to be something that was prolonged. Dehydration is going to show up in a few days and you'll eventually start to look sunken in. Your body is going to try to pull water from wherever it can, which is why you start to see the loss of skin turgor instead of the skin being nice and bouncy. Somebody could have been able to pick up that child's skin and it would literally still tint because it doesn't have the fluid to stay bouncy. So there were signs that this was happening unless they kept him, obviously closed in, which they perfectly could have, right? Because he was not of the age where it was mandated that he go to school. That doesn't start until you're in kindergarten. You know what I mean? So like they
Yeah.
didn't have to do this for a long period of time, but I suspect that this is something that was ongoing and maybe they kind of toyed with these things along the way and this time it went too far.
Well, because I also think, and this might get, I think talking about the science is so important, kind of taking us into what an autopsy actually is, because we often hear about the results, but not what it takes to actually get that part done. How do you figure out whether this was a case of 7 days of, prolonged malnourishment, allegedly based on what we heard, or if this was something that was going on for a longer period of time? Like, what would you see that could, as I'm sure prosecutors want to know exactly if this is everything's true that we've read to this point, piecing together what happened to this child and how long any sort of potential abuse or neglect was taking place. Like, how are you able to see that?
So they will also take a look at the muscles. I suspect that the forensic pathologist will probably take a sample of the muscles of this child to see if there was any breakdown of that muscular tissue to see if the body had literally started to feed on itself. But again, that vitreous, the fluid that we take from the eye, sending that off to the lab to look at those different electrolyte levels is going to be so important in this case. Any blood that was able to be obtained from the child. Because here's the other part, just because the child is there doesn't mean that we're able to get these super large samples. So, taking samples from the kidneys, from the liver, from the brain, these are all going to be things that give us answers about the question of dehydration and possibly how long it was happening. Now, will it tell us if this was 2 or 3 months? No, it won't. But what we know about the human body is that it cannot survive more than 7 days without some sort of water or hydration. And so again, during this possible 7 days that this child endured, this dehydration or abuse or malnourishment, it doesn't take long for a child's body to start feeding on itself and those fat stores start to be used up as energy. And that's why they have that sunken in, cachectic, famished kind of look because their bodies are literally trying to feed on themselves. It's very sad to think about this state that this young boy had to live in to get to this point of death.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, none of these child abuse stories are ever easy to talk about, but it's just it's not, every case where we get an arrest warrant that will detail the specifics of how law enforcement knew in their mind that abuse was what they were dealing with. He was 21 pounds, this 4-year-old boy, and just from typically between, I think, like 30 and 40 pounds is where you want a child of that age to be. And to only be 21 pounds, which is, roughly 9 or 10 pounds less. I mean, just from a scientific standpoint, I guess how light is that for someone of that age? And what does that do to the body, knowing that there aren't, potentially just the muscle and fat that a body needs to be able to create weight and survive?
Right. When you think about you have two 10-pound dumbbells, this child weighed about the amount of two 10-pound dumbbells. Like to give people a visual of what that is, if you pick those up and you have this kid who's 4 years old who should be solid and growing and hydrated and nourished and he isn't. So 2 10-pound dumbbells were almost as big as this kid. Like the visual of that for me is just heartbreaking.
It really is. And I know that the parents are now facing, in relation to the death of Isiah, it's a murder charge.
Mhm.
Just in South Carolina, how does that work? Because I know in some states you see a neglect charge, in other states it's a child abuse charge, but then here in South Carolina, it's murder and they could go to jail for 20 years to life.
So I never try to speak on like what the legal charges would be because I'm not an attorney. I
Sure.
will tell you that as the coroner ruling this case, something like this as a homicide based on the information that we gather through the science and the investigation is more than likely going to happen. So I would suspect that the Oconee County coroner is going to put this down as a homicide. And then in the legal province, they're going to have to figure out what charges they can give to these parents. Was it neglect? And now, usually, your forensic pathologist is going to take the information from the investigation. So they're going to sit down and speak with the coroner and say, okay, what else did you all find? Remember, Chris, every state is supposed to do a child fatality review. So you're going to have the solicitors there, you're going to have DSS there, you're going to have law enforcement and the coroner's office and the forensic pathologist. Everybody is going to come to that one location and say, what happened here? What signs may have been missed? Did the system fail this child? Was this a DSS case? Had anyone ever known about this? This is why shows like this are so important, because while you may not think that you live in a neighborhood or know people who could potentially do something like this, hearing this information will hopefully send red flags to the people who are suspecting that something is going on, or hey, that child certainly looks like they're losing weight. We saw him at the playground 3 weeks ago and he didn't look like that. Hopefully this forces people to say something if they see something. But with a case like this, that child fatality review is going to be really important, but they're not escaping homicide. And if it was intentional, which again, I don't know how you don't feed a 4-year-old, those parents are going to have to, I guess their defense is going to have to try to say something about why they weren't feeding this child. If he didn't have any medical issues that prevented him from eating or drinking, if he didn't have any cognitive delays that prevented him from eating or drinking, how else do you explain the state that his body was found in? And that's going to be for the defense and for the prosecutors to look into.
And also just reading through the arrest warrant and what SLED put out, and saying that the EMTs arrived. This is an unresponsive infant or toddler, and then the coroner's called 20 minutes later. Just for you in that line of work, what is that drive over to that house like, knowing that you might be walking into something that is a potential crime scene, and you're going to have to deal with something as horrific as this?
Number one, Chris, all the cases are treated like homicides. So when you get that call as the coroner, you already know you could be walking into something that is not okay. That most people on their everyday, life journey in their career could never handle seeing. I just dealt with a child fatality, and I'll tell you, even people who have been doing this work for 20 something years had to take a day. They had to, what we call, you just take a knee, where you really have to separate yourself. So when you get those calls, no one wants to think that it's abuse. We don't want to believe that parents can be so cruel to children, but the reality is that it happens. And so what fuels me and what allows me to see that and to process it is I want to be able to tell that child's story. What happened to me? So that the world will know what is the truth behind my death. And that's the passion that I take into each case. I want to know what happened so that we can educate our community, so that we can help law enforcement, DSS workers, teachers, parents, our community see what signs of abuse there may have been, so that maybe next time the child doesn't die, maybe somebody calls it in, maybe someone says something. So I just always want to know why, and can we get information that may empower our community to prevent a death moving forward?
Yeah, it's so well put, because I think in a case like this, and we've seen, in child abuse cases, a parent may have something like an excuse, and they're certainly entitled to their defense and to be heard by a jury and all of
Mhm.
that. But the science and the story you're able to tell through what you find through an autopsy is so important. Are coroners, this is just a general question as well, say it was a natural death of an elderly person, they pass away in their sleep, and then you get the phone call. Are coroners typically only called out if it's suspected to be foul play?
No, if you die and it's an unwitnessed death, you die in a home, there are certain rules that we follow, certain guidelines that we have. So if someone, like let's say EMS goes out and someone has blood coming from their mouth, they still have to call the coroner's office because that's the protocol, but we may end up ruling it as a natural death based on their history or whatever the circumstances are. So it's not that every case ends up being a homicide that the coroner's office is called on. Our office last year handled over 4,000 deaths. Not all of those cases were homicide cases, but at least half of them were suspicious cases. So that's about 2,500 cases that are suspicious for homicide that we were able to then rule out, and say, okay, this is not what that is. So while people think that the coroner is called every single time, that's not true, but we do handle quite a bit of cases.
And just a really, really tough story here, but we really always appreciate your perspective, Dr. Nada Rutherford, the coroner from Richland County, South Carolina. Always great to have you on Law and Crime and help us unpack these stories.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Still a lot of questions in this story remain unanswered, including what exactly happened inside that home to get to the point that Isiah would be in the condition that the coroner says he was in at the time that he died. We'll continue following this story. But that will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.